Welcome to Savage Minds, and I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Emma Hilton, a developmental biologist at the University of Manchester and a keen amateur sportswoman who has spent time studying sex segregation in sport, the impact of physical anatomy on performance, and the necessity for protected category for female athletes. Emma has recently published an academic review of muscle and strength retention in the suppression of testosterone by trans-identified males, and she has consulted with a major sports federation reviewing their policy for the inclusion of these males in female sport. I welcome Emma to Savage Minds. I remember how we came to speak originally. It was exactly 2 years ago. I went to search our tweets to each other, not our tweets, our private messages, when I came to you, when I was working on a trans sports piece for Quillette, and I reached out to you to ask you about certain data. Thank you for that again. But can you tell me what brought you to this debate about gender identity, transgender issues, about trans-identified males in sports, in women's sports, and what has driven you to this, a topic that not only has passion so high on all sides, but which is quite castigating for women?
So I think that I came to this kind of accidentally, in that it's kind of like, imagine a Venn diagram with lots of overlapping characteristics that need someone who fits all of those, maybe to have said, oh, hang on a minute, no, really, this is not happening. So, 20 years ago, I didn't really think too deeply about this. I was your kind of standard feminist who was shouting about kind of pro-choice issues and, this kind of thing. So a kind of broadly, but not particularly politically active feminist background. And then combining that as a developmental biologist, where you've got this kind of very intrinsic, this kind of taught awareness about how bodies are different and how they're different and how they become different. And then I generally like sports. I like a lot of sports. I play sports. I like watching sports. There's nothing that I think I turn off. Maybe skiing occasionally, but there's no sport I can't sit down and actually just kind of watch. So you've got this kind of feminism overlapping with developmental biology, overlapping with a love of sports. And it just seemed then that I remember, I think the first time that I thought, oh, hang on, this is not right, was Fallon Fox. And so for those who don't know, the Fallon Fox case is a transgender woman who is an ex-US Navy veteran who transitioned as male to female, whatever language we're using there, who transitioned and became a mixed martial arts fighter. So now you have this male, not just a male, but a very strong kind of, someone who's been fit and active and very strong for their entire life. Being in a ring where really it's not just a combat sport, it's an anything goes kind of combat sport. And then, of course, the fight with Tamika Brent, where her orbital socket was shattered and she needed her head stitched together or stapled together. And I remember looking then and thinking, I thought everyone knew that sports was kind of quite an obvious thing. Like, one could create social discussions or philosophical discussions about bathroom use or that kind of thing. But sports just always seems to me like something that would be just so obvious that females and males need to be separated, especially in this kind of very vivid environment where a female is bleeding because she's been battered, that I thought, oh, hang on, what's going on here? Is this transgender woman really comparable with a female in terms of, output, performance? I knew from a developmental biology background that this male was not going to have developed along the same lines. But what happens when you change hormones. So I kind of really decided then I was going to have a look, because my intuition was it's not fair, but I think my scientific brain took over and said, well, hang on, you can't just say stuff like it's not fair. You're probably going to have to justify that at some point. So I think these three things: feminism, developmental biology, and really wanting, you know, females to have a fair shot at sports and not bleed too heavily because of this. So that's my background here.
The Fallon Fox thing, that was like 4 years ago, correct?
Yeah, something like that. Feels about right. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember walking through a market in Islington when this happened, and someone was alerting me about this. And it does seem surreal that you would have a lot of left-leaning, politically left-leaning people saying that this is the humane thing to do. Because a lot of women I've spoken to told me that it was the misogyny pushing the drive to almost excitedly see men beat up women. You know, I mean, there was something symbolic about that that makes me wonder how people on the left are supporting this.
Yeah, I think the kind of, obviously and quite rightly, the way that society responds to violence against women and girls, with the horror and, you know, the sanctions and the criminalization, obviously, and then the initiatives to help women and girls get out of this. And so we have a really strong social convention that, you know, like, men don't hit women because the chances of them really hurting women are big. You know, this is not an equal fight. We intrinsically, intuitively understand that. And then seeing this being, like you say, not only permitted but applauded as some kind of victory, that at its basis level, we as a society got to a place where we were watching, like I say, not just a regular old male, but a strong, fit, active male, with combat experience, in a ring, being applauded to punch a female in the face. And I just thought, this is what lens are people looking at here where this is a good thing? How can this be a good thing?
I think it's insane. I mean, from 2013, I've been writing about this, but one thing I noticed very early on was the trans lobby's desire to glue themselves to the intersex debate. And this is highly linked to the sporting debate. For instance, I remember back when we spoke the first time 2 years ago, you had written me a comment about what was happening conterminous to the discussion about transgender males who identify as women wanting to enter women's sports and the Castor-Semenya debate. And I wanted to ask, why is the Castor-Semenya debate so important to this about trans, since Semenya is considered so controversial, especially in parallel to the story of transgender in sports? You wrote me 2 years ago this, I'm just going to quote you if I may, it's nothing scandalous. For instance, the IOC could have lowered the upper T limit in 400 meters, 400 H, what does H mean? Sorry. And 800 meters.
Hurdles.
Thank you. That's it. Hammer and pole vault. Instead, they lowered the upper T in an apparently arbitrary fashion that coincidentally, you put that word in quotes, covers all the events that Semenya competes in. Can you explain that to our audience? Because I think a lot of people don't understand the controversy around the T and the intersex being conflated by the transgender lobby.
So 2 years ago, I didn't understand, and nor did the general population who are interested in this kind of thing, didn't understand as much about Semenya's biology as we do now. And so at that point, I was considering the kind of default to a simple explanation, which was that she's female, she's XX, she's got ovaries, and she's got high testosterone for some kind of reason. The most obvious to me was that some kind of adrenal problem, where her adrenal glands are going to start making too much testosterone. And at this point, where the IAAF, now World Athletics, when they, and I do believe they pursued not just Semenya, but other women in the same position as her. And World Athletics knew years ago what DSD Semenya had, and that there were other women with the same DSD. That they created an argument where they knew that they wanted to regulate athletes, and we'll come back to how good the regulation is at some point, I'm sure. They wanted to regulate certain athletes, but instead of trying to address the athletes' biology, what they did was try and create a kind of event-specific rule, which then was very clear to anyone looking at it. It was targeting specific athletes, and many particularly. And that's very scientifically unsatisfactory. If someone has an advantage because of whatever advantage, wherever, then you can see that, for example, in this case, high testosterone that leads to a performance advantage, that's going to apply across the board. But it's almost like, I don't know if World Athletics are a bit cowardly that they didn't want to just lay it on the line and say, look, these are women with aspects of male biology that are relevant to sport, and we need to think about how we're going to regulate this. What they did was create this, what I think is a really biased study, trying to find advantage in female events, and ended up only being able, by some statistical trickery, only ended up being able to find advantage in a certain number of events. But those events didn't cover every event that Caster Semenya was competing in. So then they created a rule that wasn't based on even the statistical trickery that they'd employed to find those events. And so it was very obvious looking from a scientific point of view. It must have been even more obvious if you were within the kind of World Athletics scrutiny type of environment, that this was an absolute, contrived effort. And so obviously then you've got a lot of people defending Semenya and the other athletes that she represented. She's taken a lot of the kind of hit from this, but she was only one of a group of athletes who were challenging these rules. So you've got a lot of scientists saying, hang on, this is not right. These rules are quite, as it stands, quite arbitrary. They're not based in any good science. So that was the background to when we spoke.
Explain what DSD is, because a lot of people don't understand what this means for the term of intersex.
Okay, so DSD stands for variously, depending on your preference, and it may obviously change within context. Originally, defects of sex development, differences of sex development. Some people are moving towards variations of sex characteristics. So, but essentially they all describe the same thing, which is people who during their development have some kind of variation from the typical pathways of male or female. And so that their reproductive anatomy, their endocrinology, their genetics, they don't always align in kind of neat kind of order. And so this creates some unusual situations. DSDs are rare. But it can create some unusual situations in sports, particularly, where one might try to understand, sports is segregated by male or female, mostly on secondary sex characteristics, that is males with bigger muscles and they're taller and all those kinds of things. So trying to understand DSDs, which are not a monolith, they're not a single group that, all do the same thing to a genetic male or to a genetic female. trying to understand how performance might be affected or not affected can be a bit tricky.
Well, I remember your piece that you wrote with Colin Wright earlier this
Yeah,
year in the Wall Street Journal. You guys put forth this highly controversial theory that human beings are born of one of two sexes. This seemed
you're
to,
trolling me now.
yeah, well, this caused such an outrage, and it was really shocking to me that people were taking up what is a given, really an incontrovertible medical fact that sex is binary, right? And so, how was your article received after you two published this? I mean, were you guys pushed back upon by the wokerati?
So we've had lots of pushback. I have to say, I'm a scientist, not a journalist, and as is Colin, and we discussed briefly about what the significance of first author versus last author was in journalism versus, in a scientific article where it would clearly place you in a kind of hierarchy, I guess. Anyway, I suspect Colin, well, I'm pretty sure Colin has got the most pushback from this. Whereas I kind of, yeah, it wasn't too bad, if I'm honest. I didn't expect it. I think as a British person as well, now Colin is American, so he will have had a much clearer idea about the Wall Street Journal and the placement and the readership and those kinds of things. I'm British. I just thought we were, we're writing some kind of, it was an opinion, but really, is it an opinion? And so we wrote it. So I think as the kind of British half of this, I didn't really get the pushback that perhaps Colin, as the American author, did. But it's been interesting. It's been used as a kind of abuse. The Wall Street Journal is, I understand, fairly conservative, and they explore some interesting ideas that aren't always necessarily embedded in huge amounts of science. So they've got some track record of, being kind of very open to lots of kind of slightly left field stuff. Now, I'm not remotely suggesting two scientists, an evolutionary biologist and a developmental biologist, asserting the idea that sex is binary is in any way left field. But what was surprising to me, that was my first, and I believe Colin's first movement into kind of mainstream media. And it's very different to how academia treats you, where there's a kind of pseudo politeness, and people try and rebut what you're saying, but they back it up with sources and they present you with overwhelming evidence that you're wrong. The Wall Street Journal, I just got called lots of names on social media, and that I didn't understand biology, that I was a disgrace to my university, that like you say, that the concept of binary sex as if it's some kind of revolutionary novel idea is just insane. It's not revolutionary, it's evolutionary. It's not novel. It's essentially how we propagate ourselves as a species. It's not a controversial topic. It just needed saying because it's so uncontroversial. Nobody had thought to stick their, heads up there and say it before. So it was interesting, and, turf and...
And in that article, the two of you developed this idea, though, I mean, that is not at all controversial to anyone who studied science, that humans are effectively sexually dimorphic. And you both wrote, the argument is that because some people are intersex, they have developmental conditions resulting in ambiguous sex characteristics. The categories male and female exist on a spectrum and are therefore more than social constructs. And you continue to write, if male and female are merely arbitrary groupings, it follows that everyone, regardless of genetics or anatomy, should be free to choose to identify as male or female, or to reject sex entirely in favor of a new bespoke gender identity. Well, of course, this reminds me of a tweet from yesterday of Tatiana McGrath, who shows a chart about COVID victims, and it's, a pie chart, roughly half male, half female. And McGrath writes, see, us non-binary types, we are superior. We completely, what was the word? We're immune to this, which was a double entendre, of course. But I'm wondering, something in 2020, even back in 2013, I was trolled by people online for saying that only females had menstruation. Now here we are, 8 years later, menstruators, vagina havers, never penis havers, never scrotum hangers, never, I call them front noodlers, because I figure we need to have something to even it out and to have light laughter. But I'm just wondering then, why is it that the trans lobby has gone for intersex? Is this a political maneuvering?
So my read of it is that the deliberate undermining of the very basic biological phenomena of male and female is an attempt to suggest that nobody can really say whether they're male or female, and there are some arguments, and not, very few of us have been carrier types, and we don't know what our chromosomes are, these kinds of things. So it's trying to say to people, well, you don't know if you're really truly female or if you're really truly male, because there are some cases where it's not so clear cut. Now, I said earlier, those cases are rare, and we understand them in as these variations from two very well-established evolutionary well-established pathways. It's just an attempt to say there's no such thing as a male or there's no such thing as a female. The easiest response to that, I've always found, is you're the product of a male and a female, and only one male and only one female in a very specific conformation. That is, the female that you came from made an egg, and the male that you came from made a sperm, and those two got together 1-to-1, only an egg and a sperm, not two sperms, not two eggs, and so this is, I think people, what am I trying to say here? That people are trying to undermine something which is self-evident as a project of their own selves. They are only here because males and females exist. So it's always seemed to me a very ridiculous argument. The better argument, better being relative, is how we understand males and females within society, and where there are exceptions, where there are legal definitions that don't necessarily map to biological definitions. But the whole kind of sex doesn't really exist. It's just patently looking up your own family tree, absolutely nonsense.
Also, that plus the fact that when they reach out for that argument, often the trans advocates, both trans people and their allies, reach for there are women who are 6'5" and 7 feet tall. Okay, yeah, sure, they're anomalies. And then they go to, but we could argue that all sports people are just freaks. Have you seen that quote? Everyone who's in sport is just freaky. They all have freaky bodies. And people refer to Michael Phelps. Apparently he has some kind of special deal with his shoulders that are hyperextended. Don't ask me. I don't follow Michael Phelps. But, I've seen all these arguments to basically say that because there are women who are 6'10", that they should, there's two various arguments out there for this, but about two. One is, well, that she could actually become be considered a man because she has all these male secondary characteristics. And on the other hand, they say, well, that just is proof that sex is fluid.
Well, I think they're two slightly different frameworks. So fluid implies some ability to change, and I think that's no. Okay, scrub that. So there's two slightly different frameworks there. The first is that one would judge sex, which in evolutionary and developmental terms is defined as your role in reproduction, whether you fulfill that role or not, whether you choose to fulfill that role or whether you're unable to fulfill that role. That it's defined as, it really is just whether you're going to be a mum or a dad, whether you're going to produce an egg or a sperm, or if you're a plant, you're going to produce an ovule or a pollen, So that it's as simple as that. It's a very basic definition. It should be entirely neutral. It shouldn't mean anything about anyone's life, etc. What we have with secondary sex characteristics are not characteristics that are necessary for that reproductive role. They're not directly involved in making eggs or sperm or making them come together. No pun intended. But are improving your fitness about being selected to be the male who provides a sperm, or to be the female who is, the subject of male attention and whose eggs are competitively advantageous in that sense. So secondary sex characteristics are a little more blurry, a little more overlapping.
But they also exist because they're results of the ova and the sperm, for instance.
Absolutely. So everything is a hierarchy. When, from 7 weeks in utero, when your gonads, these are, tiny little balls of cells that are a bit like skin cells, not quite, but that kind of, type of tissue. These little balls in your abdomen just decide, well, they don't decide, but they've got genetic information to tell them you're going to start becoming a testicle, or you're going to start becoming an ovary. And that's really the very first thing that happens. Some people will argue that the genetic information that you acquire at conception is the first thing that happens, but these are really very tiny nuances within the whole context. Anatomically, the very first thing that happens is your body decides whether you're going to be, ultimately, as I say, whether you fulfill that role or whether you're unable to because of various, injuries, disease, that kind of thing, whether you're going to make sperm or whether you're going to make eggs. And everything follows from that. Once your gonads have said we're going to be testicles or we're going to be ovaries, then your body plan, your internal genitalia, so females that's uterus and fallopian tubes and cervix, that kind of thing, and in males vas deferens, so the tube that takes sperm from the testicles to the penis. All of these things follow on from that. It's a cascade of developmental events that all rely on that first primary switch. And then, so that's your reproductive anatomy set up. And when you're born, that's very easily and reliably observed. And
not assigned.
Not assigned. No. The link between what external genitalia you present at birth and your future reproductive potential is an incredibly high correlation.
You're listening to Savage Minds. We hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We depend on listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Many trans advocates state, I'm sorry, I'm having to go through this with you. I know you're going to crack up here, but the typical go-to now would be for me to say, but in the womb, I was exposed to
androgen insensitivity syndrome.
That's it. Androgen insensitivity syndrome. Thank you. Why are trans advocates reaching for that one? Because that hasn't actually been proven, to my knowledge. It's a theory.
No, it absolutely hasn't. And so androgen insensitivity syndrome is a biology where you have an XY embryo, so would typically develop into a healthy male. But you have a situation where that embryo can't respond to testosterone. which is the hormone that drives a lot of male development. So what you have is an embryo that's developing, and at 7 weeks it switches on testicle development, and it starts to make testosterone, but it can't respond to testosterone. And so as a result of that, the embryo, in terms of its external genitalia, looks completely female. Would be observed at birth as female with no problem. Or with no clue that there was anything wrong. In fact, most women with complete androgen sensitivity syndrome don't know that there's anything atypical about their bodies until they fail to menstruate, kind of, in a timely fashion. So this has been my understanding from just reading various Twitter account, is that this has been taken up. If testosterone is the thing that makes you masculine, it masculinizes your body in terms of reproductive anatomy, which is certainly true. And we know that brains respond to hormones. That if your brain doesn't respond to testosterone because you have some kind of insensitivity to testosterone, then your brain cannot be masculinized, and therefore your brain is feminized. Now, this is the line of thought. I don't think there's much scientific data to back it up, because the logical outcome of that would be that women with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, that is women who have absolutely no response to testosterone in any part of their body, which would include their brain, that they should be the ultimate, like, feminine kind of character. Do you understand? That if they have absolutely no response to testosterone, they must be uber feminine. And actually, they're just normal personality bearing.
They're not fainting,
going around the world.
Thoughts.
So I don't really buy. There is a brain response to hormones, but pursuing the idea that that an intersex disorder would lead to trans, or some kind of gender identity, just seems to fall at all kinds of hurdles.
Well, there's also another question that I've been niggled by from the very beginning of my entry into this debate. I say this all the time. I think it even when I'm not saying it. But what in the heck does it mean to feel feminine? These are social constructions. What does it mean to have a female brain? I've interviewed Cordelia Fine. I've read Spelke. There's just a body of evidence by scientists who had to push back against what Steven Pinker and Baron Cohen did in the 90s, which was to sort of foment this space of, well, there really is a gendered brain. Now, I have real issues when I hear people categorizing what is a woman's brain without any first evidence of what that means, what it implicates within society or for the self. I mean, like you say, is a woman who has this insensitivity supposed to be just fainting on the streets and people come up with smelling salts and give her taffeta dresses and she's running around like Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind? I mean, what does this mean to be ultimately feminine? And inversely, I'd say the opposite, which is true to my life. I learned femininity not from women. I learned femininity from men. I learned femininity quite a bit from men when I was living in the Arab world, because there's a certain femininity that I personally key into, because the kind of femininity I don't find, for lack of a better word, vomitacious. I'm not one of these people who fares well, never was, when, like in high school, I'm American, girls would show me their boyfriend's sport ring. I don't even know the term. See, I can't even say it. I didn't say it.
Like the class ring.
But that's it, the class. You see, you know it better than me. I've
grown up on American, like, dating.
Yeah, so you watched Baywatch. Well, the thing is I was just like, who cares? Like, that did not interest me. Did that not interest me because I don't have enough feminine hormones in me? Or is it just part of my personality, which is what I suspect? And And again, you're a scientist and you are not a front noodler. So how are we supposed to should I believe you? Should I believe anything you say because you have a female brain? You see what I mean? This is
Yeah. I
insane to
think
me.
there's some nuance here, and as ever, when you read on social media in the various battles of essays and that kind of thing, this idea that either we are blank slates, and that every behavior that we exhibit has been taught to us or socialized into us consciously or subconsciously, versus a very kind of innate masculine, feminine brain. I think there is a middle ground. I'm not suggesting it's exactly in the middle, but I think there's something in between there somewhere. So I would argue something like testosterone, if you have lots of testosterone, like males do, that this has an evolutionary benefit. That it makes you, first of all, it changes your body, it makes you fast and strong, so you can go and hunt lots of, I don't know, lions, or more likely kind of bison or something like that. But it also means that, for example, your reaction times are quicker, you're perhaps a bit more aggressive. I think that biological reality can exist, that testosterone does have an effect on behavior, but that the manifestation of that behavior can be socialized. So in today's society, where we kind of privileged white Westerners don't have to hunt for our meat, we still have the males with aggressive traits. Now, many males will channel that into, spending lots of their company's money on a stock exchange and a risky trade deal, and they'll get, the massive rush after that. They may invest that aggressive, risk-taking behavior into a dodgy relationship. They may manifest it in violence against their female partner. Those are choices that society and how people are socialized to behave happen. That the base permissive factor is that males are naturally, evolutionarily designed to be aggressive risk takers. Like I say, how that manifests is, I think, socialization.
Well, when you were going through the list of examples of aggression, I was thinking also the way, yes, that men socially, acceptably so, are able to express themselves, such as the infamous midlife crisis, Corvette, or whatever sports car. Recently, however, it's been suggested by many feminists that the postmodern version of this is, but I'm a lady. And I was thinking about this in terms of also how you were positing this with, the larger scope of male aggressivity, because much of the lefty, supporters of this kind of identification as a woman or identification as a man process are viewing this as courageous, brave, true self. You've heard all that nonsense. But I do think that there's something quite aggressive about it, because who's in the crosshairs of this movement are women, children as well, but primarily women. And there seems to be something quite aggressive about the way this lobby has taken on, like the IOC. Look at, I will say his name, but Joanna Harper isn't doing this by coincidence. I've seen so many well-placed trans scholars who are out there churning the trans production theory machine. And it bothers me as a scholar myself, because I'm like, wait, queer theory has its uses. Back in 92, there were some excellent books, and it was more about mainstreaming gay desire. It was just called queer, maybe because that was also a way in a prudish culture like my own, where sex means we can't say that word in front of the kids. They would say gender, and that's where the solipsism has come in there as well. But also in terms of this late 20th century culture wanting to affirm everyone's happiness, and we're all like creating this community, and somehow we got lost between where science lines up certain truths that we need to benefit our bodies and our lives, and on the other hand where it's inconvenient because, well, George wants to be Georgina and I think I should support her in this process. So that is brave, not scientists saying, but hold on, there is something behind the fact that maybe men getting women's blood for a transfusion might cause them harm because there are real somatic differences between the sexes.
Yeah, I think, and I'm not the kind of best place to have like a long view on politics and political systems. It seems that there's been a bit of a coming together. So if we take the kind of, and I agree with you, I think we have to be careful in the sense that I think that, you know, I can understand that gender dysphoria is a thing. I think part of that is because I'm female and we've grown up we're understanding, you know, like hating our bodies and that kind of thing. And so I do understand that someone can really hate, they can look in a mirror and just really, not just hate, but be disgusted, feel alienated from their bodies. And so I do think gender dysphoria is a thing, and we need to kind of probably be quite sympathetic and try and work through that as something quite different to, you know, the like you say, the what most of us would characterize as a midlife crisis. Probably also just a time that, I don't know, males just want to experiment with their sex life because they have some kind of internalized, you know, homophobia from, you know, expressing themselves when they were younger. I don't know. But it does come at a time where the left, the political left, seem to have embraced the idea that the individual is the key unit in a political ideology, and that what the individual, and we're talking about any individual now who makes demands about their own kind of state rather than what my traditional understanding of the left is kind of classes that, you know, hierarchies, whether those hierarchies need to exist, but do they exist, and how power is moved through those hierarchies. The movement of the left towards a position that I would traditionally consider quite a conservative position, the individual over, you know, a group. And these two things suddenly in this last 5 years, or like you say, you've been around this discussion a lot longer than I have, the last 10 or longer years, in mainstream, you know, we can talk about feminists who saw this coming a long time ago. It just collided in a way that means we don't really have, we're kind of blindsided, aren't we? That how are the political left favouring the individual over the class, which, and by, you know, I mean kind of male as the kind of dominant class here. They're favouring individual males over the traditionally subordinated class, females, but saying that must take precedent, which, you're right, does feel, and people do argue quite reasonably that looks like a kind of invasion, a colonization, an act of aggression. And we wouldn't let it happen. It wouldn't be happening with any other group of, you know, I suspect you're not overly keen on defining kind of oppressor and oppressed classes, but we wouldn't let it happen with any other of these traditionally defined power structures. So why is this happening for males and females, where suddenly I'm talking with males who have fathered children who are saying that there's no difference between me, you know, a very typical average female, that there's no difference, there's no physical difference, and I have no recourse to argue that there's a physical difference, and that maybe I might need in certain circumstances some kind of special consideration. Not much, but sometimes I might need some special consideration. It's just it's an insane collision of the left having completely lost its head. And then this age-old, misogyny or aggression, male aggression, that kind of thing, it's just collided in this extreme.
The hyper-atomization of individuals is something that, the focus on individualism as well is something we heard from Margaret Thatcher. Today, this is being echoed by the left. So it's quite disturbing to me. Another thing that's also disturbing is that these people pick and choose what science is real. Ask any of them if COVID is real, and I dare say we wouldn't see COVID is on a scale. It's a gray zone. Well, sure, the readings maybe from the PCR tests are on a scale, but the actual disease itself is not invented. I was assigned COVID at cough or whatnot. And here we have something that's still very much under investigation since COVID is so new, whereas human dimorphism is not.
But
and we've had...
They don't disagree, the other side.
Yeah.
They don't disagree that science is real. They like the scientific articles, and I'm fairly neutral to those scientific articles that say, here's a proof that gender identity for some people exists, that we can detect it in some kind of molecular signature. I'm kind of hypothesizing that, but we can detect it in some people in some kind of genetic background or some kind of brain function or whatever. I'm entirely neutral to some people feeling gender identity and that being a part of their biology. So the other side likes that science. What they say is that that's real science. What they ignore is a billion years of evolution, the evidence of their own eyes, the evidence of their own mum and dad, to say that science isn't real. And there's a balance here. Science is always a bit of a kind of, how much is on one side, how much is on the other, what position are we taking right now, how do we move forward, how do we close gaps, how do we find flaws and close those gaps. It's just a complete rejection of science that nobody's ever even thought to question. The problem of finding a reference that says, humans come in male and female form, because I said earlier, nobody ever thought to write that, because it's so self-evident. So they do believe in science, just not the science that is the massive weight of evidence that they don't like.
Well, one burden on them to prove is the existence of gender identity, which, yes, might be hard to prove, but it is not proven as yet. And a feeling is not proof. I can have a feeling that I should own Buckingham Palace because let's say I like it or whatnot. I mean, that's not proof. And we can go over land reform and problems of capitalism and who should or should not own land. But when we come to what words mean, right, that becomes also a space of play, which is why I started asking you about intersex, because one of the reasons that many people don't understand why intersex is playing such a role by the trans lobby in sports is because of the two assignations of intersex. I'm going to say two. I mean, one could say there are more, but I'm thinking of Anna Foster Sterling's definition of what intersex means and what Leonard Sachs has detailed as intersex. And he says, I'm quoting him, using Foster Sterling's definition of intersex as, quote, any deviation from the Platonic ideal, she lists the following conditions as intersex. I'm not going to read them all, but she goes through congenital adrenal hyperplasia, other non-XXXY excluding Turner and Klinefelter syndromes, Turner syndrome, and he goes through a long list here. But then he says the chief problem with this list is that the 5 most common conditions listed are not intersex conditions. If we examine these 5 conditions in more detail, we will see that there is no meaningful clinical sense in which these conditions can be considered intersex. So then he deconstructs what she calls the deviation from the Platonic ideal, because he says this deviation is not a clinically useful criterion for defining medical conditions like intersex. So why is it now that intersex has become this hot topic debate within the trans sporting world And why are some conditions that are not intersex being strangely co-opted by the transgender sports camp? What's in it for them?
So what's in it for the for trans women who want to compete in female categories is the solution that was proposed for hyperandrogenic females, and and for women who are genetically male with high testosterone. So the pragmatic solution that was proposed by World Athletics, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee first, and then World Athletics, is that if advantage is mediated by testosterone, and here are some women who have some male traits, and that says nothing about their legal or social, identity or that kind of thing, but who biologically have male traits which involve high testosterone, then it seems very intuitive to say, well, if you reduce testosterone, then that advantage will be lost. Now, in terms of developmental biology, that makes absolutely no sense. There's no necessary symmetry in high testosterone causing X and then low testosterone removing X. There's no precedent for that to be a given. But this solution that was brought about, and I think there are with women with DSD, so women who might be genetically male and who might have testes and who are pumping out testosterone, who from a developmental biology point of view one might describe as male. And there are some social factors that enter here, that these women have understood themselves to be female, that they have grown up, under the same kind of pressures that females do. So I'm aware that there are some kind of non-physical reasons to try and discuss rules around women with DSDs. But what the solution that was come up with to enable these women to compete was to lower testosterone, and that would make any advantage would be removed then, and that seems to have, I guess, kind of logically, but then been promoted quite heavily that why if you've got an XY genetic male with testes who makes testosterone and who is androgenized, who is responding, it's certainly through puberty with increased muscle and that kind of thing. If lowering testosterone works on that body, why doesn't it? How can you discriminate between that body and the body of a healthy male? Now, I could think of 10 arguments why those two situations aren't comparable, but I'm not entirely sure. If I can speak really plainly, I'm not entirely sure that the IOC, World Athletics, other major sports events were kind of, I think they were caught a bit on the back foot here. And so trying to regulate doping in the female category, trying to regulate the occasional XY woman in the female category, trying to understand how that DSD impacted on performance, and regulating for that, and these regulations just seem to have been repurposed for healthy males, as if that if they were going to work on one group, then they must work on the other group. And actually, what I'm finding, and what I've published a paper this year or a review rather, the solution doesn't work. The solution isn't working, let alone this conflation of categories. The solution that was proposed for one of these groups of people is unlikely to be working. So it's advantageous because the rules were already established for women with male kind of biology in sports. So it just seemed very easy to transfer it to transgender women. And now this has been retroactively fitted to be an inclusive, initiative, as if fairness and safety are not a priority here.
This is also the recent rulings by World Rugby and then other rugby associations nationally. It's really a battleground for wokeness. I mean, we were happy with some of the decisions being made to protect not only women's bodies, which is probably the number one issue physically, but number one issue politically is how long have women had to fight? I mean, women weren't even allowed in marathons until the 1970s. When you start to add up, I've spoken to some of the schoolgirls in Connecticut who are out scholarships in a country where paying for university is more than paying for a house in most parts of the country.
Have you seen, so there's a court case in Idaho at the moment. It's probably going to go all the way through the legislature in the States, which is to prevent, males competing in female sports. And it's defending females who should not be advantaged because of their sex under a federal law called Title IX. So this case has attracted a lot of attention because it's quite bold. We've seen the amount of abuse that World Rugby got for being as bold and saying transgender women can't compete in the female category at elite kind of World Rugby governed competition. So this Idaho case was passed, and so transgender girls, in any federal funded school, couldn't compete with females, and it's been challenged, and the law has been kind of suspended pending further legal investigation. And what we've seen are various kind of expert opinions and some really lovely writing from today or yesterday, I think I saw it. A group of athletes who are certainly diverse in their sexuality, who are certainly diverse in their racial makeup, who are certainly covering an awful lot of sports, who are all female, who talk about the value of sports. And I agree with nearly every word they say, that sports is important. It is important for physical and mental well-being. It is a route from poverty. It is a route from gangs, from bullying, from drugs. It creates a positive body image. It teaches our girls to be competitive, to be a bit aggressive, to be strong, to be leaders, to be confident, this kind of thing. And all these wonderful words coming from really quite famous female athletes, but in support of transgender girls. And the complete disconnect from saying transgender girls deserve the benefits of sport, but in doing so, you necessarily remove opportunity from girls, from females, is something that I really struggle to comprehend. That, if you're all of these women benefited from Title IX, and then suddenly they're saying that Title IX should apply to anyone who says they're a girl rather than female.
You mentioned the Idaho Title IX case, and that came up on my radar because I've written a lot about the sports issue.
Yeah.
One senator, and it's invariably in America, it's always the Republicans, but Mike Lee and then another Republican, Kelly Loeffler, they've spoken out about withholding federal funds from schools that allow transgender identified males to participate in women or girls sports. And Lee stated recently, this is not about being transphobic or having anything against transgender persons. This is a simple question of fairness and physical safety. So, you just spoke about this disconnect from a lot of these female athletes that signed on to a letter supporting these males and female sports. Why do you think there's such a disconnect where everyone on all sides of this debate agrees that sports have their advantages, even for male athletes, from self-esteem, physical, psychological, economic advantages? Still, we are seeing so many famous female athletes kowtow to these male athletes who identify as transgender, but they themselves, these women athletes signing on to support them, have benefited from Title IX. I mean, it's quite a paradox that many of them signing on to this letter would be even unknown had it not been for Title IX. Why do you think this is happening?
So my answer to that is kind of one of bafflement, because I really don't have a good insight into what's going on in these women's minds, and we are talking about very high profile sportswomen, who obviously feel, generally, as sports people do, they have some public duty to promote, a fairer, kind of more just society, and often, run foundations and charity work that incorporate those kinds of values. I feel that you're right, that understanding Title IX, which my understanding is nobody should be disadvantaged because of their sex. Certainly no federally run programs, and those that are in receipt of federal funding can disadvantage anyone for their sex, and that obviously manifests as female-only sports, as has been the traditional division. And when you speak with sportswomen who get this, they are equally as baffled as I am, and the only answer that we come up with is that this is a social movement where perhaps people they're kind of disconnected from the value of sports for females. And I don't know where that disconnect has happened. I genuinely don't know, because like you say, they themselves have benefited from dedicated programs, dedicated categories, from dedicated money to support them in their often brilliant careers. And I can kind of see the desire to share that with as many disadvantaged people as possible. But when it comes to sports, the disadvantage is very clearly along sex lines. And we can think about other ways to boost, other disadvantaged groups. And we know that trans people are disadvantaged in sports in the social sense, in the way that their uptake in sports is very low. They tend as a cohort to avoid exercise, particularly trans women who don't want to become particularly muscular. There are kind of aesthetic concerns about uptake in sport. There are ways that we can support better inclusion of trans people that I don't think need to simultaneously or concurrently disadvantage females. So there are many kind of arguments about, or not arguments, debates about how best to categorize. And that is what we're talking about here. We're talking about how best to categorize people within sports. We're not talking about excluding anyone from sports. We're talking about categories that are fair for all participants. But there seems to be problems along the way. The most obvious default kind of state would be to have an open category, where it's a kind of open competition, and your sex is irrelevant to your entry in that category. Whether that sits alongside a male and female category, or whether that actually replaces the male category, I don't know what the answer is there, and there are arguments for both. We could conceive of various scoring and point systems, the kind of handicapping system that you see in many sports competitions. So there are ways that we can consider the needs of trans people, and I agree with anyone who says, who talks about the value of sports for one's kind of personal growth and development. We can think about ways to include trans people that don't automatically disadvantage females.
It seems to me, as I noted recently on social media, for this lobby that's pressing. Again, not all its members are doing this, but there's a political push in recent years to propagate the fiction that sex is on a, on a spectrum, and that, trans people are non-binary, blah blah blah. But they go into specifically binaried sports divisions. And as many women have noticed, when they suggest what you have just suggested, let's have a category where people who identify as any of this umbrella, under this umbrella, can enter, the pushback is immediately no, TWAW. And there we
Yes.
go into this vicious hamster wheel, which I loathe, because it becomes very clear to me what I didn't want to believe at the beginning when I entered this research, that there's a certain political ethos to push women from their own constructed and well-established rights that they have fought for arguably centuries, because sports was, the tail end of what during the French Revolution was political voice, public space, and so forth. And
Mm-hmm.
I do have to wonder why this has happened. I mean, we've seen recently, I'm working on a piece now about institutional capture, where organizations like Stonewall in the UK or in the US, where other organizations that were previously lesbian, gay, bisexual oriented took on the T and have almost uniquely become about the T. And this institutional capture has gotten to the point that if you go onto certain websites, even Barclays at one point had the Stonewall logo, and it's all about showing their public, their consumers, that they too are woke. And I know, I hate that word at this point. Is it overused, or are we just seeing it too much? Like, we're seeing wokeness everywhere. So it's sort of silly to say, I don't like the word woke, but the reality is that this is institutional capture. It's everywhere. How many of your colleagues, you're at a major British university, how many
Mm-hmm.
people in the sciences actually believe that sex is on a spectrum?
So it's not a subject that would generally come up, not for any fear, particularly on my part. I mean, I discuss, my kind of political ideas, obviously, with my close colleagues and friends. And I certainly don't get any pushback. And lots of, we're talking about developmental biologists and a lot of medics. So sex is a very basic fact of life for us. We see it every day in a lab. We see it every day in clinics. We understand, certainly in the medical field, how sex is relevant for diagnosis, for prognosis, for treatment. We're seeing in the current, COVID pandemic, how outcomes are very different between males and females. So I think because it's one of those things that I think biologists and medics perhaps have never needed to state, because it's just one of those self-evident things. And when you look for, I get asked quite a lot for quotes, for citations from textbooks or from papers to say that, sex is binary. I don't think anyone's ever thought to frame it. You talk about males and females, and it's assumed as a base level of knowledge, which I think it is, from very young childhood. So it's very difficult to find these kind of quotes that apparently support a very evident fact of life, not just in humans, but in almost all kind of complex species. So I don't see too much kind of discussion of this at work. But when I do bring it up, it's, I have a large amount of agreement. The occasional person saying, oh, but what about this? And then, you explain what, or I would explain what I think. And they're like, oh, yeah, no, I kind of get you. But like I say, this is a very STEM-led kind of collective of people that I talk with. And I couldn't tell you how it's working in the humanities, for example.
Right. Well, ironically, I'm coming from the humanities and social sciences, where the philosophical groundwork was laid many years ago. And it didn't just stem from, let's say, Butler's work or Sedgwick's work, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who wrote Epistemology of the Closet, or any of those who were writing sort of literary interpretations of what was homosexuality. Sedgwick's work was excellent. She did a whole analysis of Victorian literature showing how men express their homosexual love for each other through their wives. It was sort of Boston marriage, 19th century style. But, the irony is that the humanities were a field for opening up certain discussions that were necessary. My God, post-colonialism is a necessary discussion that we've had to have in Western societies because of the horrors of, just think of 1947 and the separation of India, how violent that was. I mean, there's some great benefits to what some people call, toxic postmodernism. Okay, but what's really shocking to me as someone who's coming from this, and I've taught queer theory, I taught queer theory when it was about desire, homosexual desire within cinema and cultural studies, so forth, is where the shark was jumped. I mean, certainly most people studying romantic literature are not versed in evolutionary biology or any form of biology. Yet this was put out there as, in the late 90s, especially, when I started to see more that sex is whatever you feel it is, and there's a solipsism happening between academic disciplines that actually have no training in what they claim to have training in, right? Like, shouldn't literary theorists stick to literature and scientists stick to science? Okay. I mean, when I go to my doctor and my doctor opens up, David Copperfield, I will start to worry. So I just, really worry about the human rights of actual women and girls being caught up in this. Obviously, the Kira Bell ruling certainly invokes another level of worry, a deeper worry for children. But there's certainly this kind of sloppiness that has been allowed to take place. I focused one article on Davina Cooper's work, and she's a law researcher who's, I'm sure has done great work previous to this whole gender ideology research, but we're seeing people get hundreds of thousands of research funds for identity. And obviously, this will have a knock-on effect, including in the sciences. Michael Biggs's work, another who worked on the fakery of suicide stats. How can we repair this? Because it seems to me we're in this mess with science and the humanities because of spillover, where people with even, PhDs are allowed to write papers, have them published, are allowed to receive £750,000 of research to buttress a narrative that is wholly unsubstantiated. Do we go back to the grant givers? Do we have to go back to a forum like SAGE for COVID and have an examination of how this kind of intellectual malaise has been fed for at least 2 decades?
Well, I think certainly in the UK, and as you know, we are widely regarded as the global centre for pushback against this, with all of the abusive terms that accrues aimed at oneself, or indeed in complaints to one's institute. I think in the UK we are starting to see what I would just call kind of common sense. Now, I understand that common sense isn't always something that one follows slavishly as being correct, but starting to see some kind of common sense talking, some plain talking, almost putting the brakes a little bit on this. What I agree with you seems to be a kind of runaway switch in how people think, or at least for those who don't think it, an attempt to ensure that they behave as if they do think it. So in the UK, we have had some consultations, you will know there's some consultations about how trans people are recognised legally. And the current Conservative government assessed those responses and decided that self-identification of gender in a way that would allow you to alter your legal sex, that is the sex that you would then have on your birth certificate, they decided that that was a step too far, and that sex did have some meaning. And we're seeing our current Women's Minister, Liz Truss, make some very reassuring noises
that she supports, or that she understands that the female body is something different to the male body, and it has some specific needs in some specific context, which is mirrored in our Equality Act, actually, which is that largely you're not allowed to discriminate based on sex. You're not allowed to discriminate based on sex, when someone's coming for a job interview with you, or when you're allocating them medical care or housing, except when it's really important that one of the sexes, and we're talking about usually here females, when one of the sexes has been disadvantaged in some way or will be disadvantaged by failure to discriminate. So we see this in sports. You're allowed to discriminate in sports. You're allowed to discriminate where it's important for female safety. So we would think about things like shared overnight accommodation. You're allowed to ensure that people who are sharing, a dormitory in a youth hostel are allowed to be all female. So you're allowed to legally exclude males in those kinds of situations. In prisons is another key area for, that it's really important for female safety that males are excluded, certainly from their, shared living quarters. I would probably argue that we should exclude male prison officers from female prisons as well, but that may be another story. So we are starting to see some recognition, some reaffirmation, if you like, of our Equality Act, which does recognise that the female body is different, and we have specific needs that can be justified in some very, what I would say are very intuitive circumstances. But obviously in law, they need to be, written down in proper words. A problem that comes from this is understanding what those words mean. And what does the word female mean? What does the word woman mean? Because these are the words that are used in our laws and those around the world. And I think when these acts were written, our Equality Act is from 2010, that this situation that we exist in now, where certainly the word woman has been stretched, and now we're seeing that the word female is being undermined, is being questioned as if biological fact is not, a real phenomenon. And so we're seeing a kind of assault on something like our Equality Act that's very indirect, and it's making it difficult to understand how and when those laws apply, because of course the mantra, and it is a mantra, it's a slogan, that trans women are women, completely prevents you from separating females, for whom I believe, the spirit of the word woman was intended in these laws. It's intended to just stop you recognizing females as a one half of this population, and a half that have some specific needs. So it's a very indirect, it's very sneaky, it's very backdoor, I think, that if you cannot argue, as I don't think many would, that females are discriminated against in many aspects of society, whether that's intentional, whether it's violently so, it would be very difficult to say that doesn't happen. So the way to argue that females don't get protection is to say that there's no such thing as a female.
Well, this is what some athletes who have written me have stated. I had a male Olympic athlete who was really outraged by what was going on. And he said, I couldn't believe this was even happening. He thought it was sort of like The Onion, when he first read about it. He thought it was a joke article. And men are seeing this. Men who do the types of sports where bodily injury is even current amongst themselves. And I kept thinking about this. I was thinking, well, isn't this fascinating that the very idea of women's being contested in terms of sports, but yet these very same male athletes who have done sports like boxing have benefited from divisions. I mean, boxing traditionally had like 8 divisions based on weight. And
Yes.
You rarely saw someone in the super featherweight category demanding to be in the heavyweight category because discrimination, right? And as many feminists and many sports people have pointed out that some of these men arguing to bust into women's divisions are simply mediocre to bad sportsmen. Both in the term of when we say, you're a bad sport, it means about you're not a good loser, and in terms of athletic ability. And certainly there's a lot of credence to this theory, right? Because these are males who are not excelling in their category, right?
So I think there are some kind of nuances to understand, and I think that it is absolutely true that a less good male will be relatively better within a female category than that person would be in a male category. Whether someone would ever take advantage of that in a very deliberate, I am going to cheat by doing this, I don't know. I don't think we need to impute any motive. If it happens, it happens. It doesn't really concern me why it happens. What concerns me about why it might happen is that we know that internationally sports is a very dark world when you dig into what actually goes on, within countries that force their athletes to do certain things, notably the big doping scandals in the kind of Eastern Bloc, former communist countries in Europe and Russia. Well, Russia's still continuing into modern times. So we know that states will use sport as a political tool. The whole Eastern Bloc intent was to become good at sports, and that would improve their political standing within global in a global community. And so we know that states will force athletes to do things, even if the athletes themselves are not particularly willing to do that. And so it doesn't concern me in terms of bad motive at the athlete level. I'm actually more concerned about how a state might utilize this. And I really don't think it's too much to imagine that that states will take advantage of these rules in order to win at sports.
I mean, I wasn't trying to suggest that trans athletes are trying to invade women's sports because of something, divisive or nefarious. I do think, though, that it's something that needs to be put on the table, that by being mediocre in a category, happenstance, does not mean that one should then be ushered through sports where, again, this goes back to even psychological development of women and girls. And I have to include women in this because it's not like our psychological life ends when we're 18, any less or more than men's. And there's something to competition. And those who do say, I'm going to forego university and spend these years doing this sport. I've known people who do the same in the dance world, for instance, and they go back to university later after their dance career is finished. And there's a reason for this. These are careers that have a shelf life. And I do think that as a society, as a democratic society, hopefully we can have this discussion. As you and I have both seen on Twitter and elsewhere, it's a hard discussion to have without being called four-letter words. Now, how can we go forward with this, given, Euron Collins' piece was really lovely. It was so respectful. And of course, people are still called names, no matter how respectful they write about the subject, because capitulation seems to me to be the only choice that our side, if I can say, is given. And our side isn't saying trans people should be in a gulag or trans people should never play sports, because of course it's always posited that way. Trans women have a right to sports. Well, no one's saying that these people should not do sports. We're simply saying, let's create a modality that they can do their sports and women and girls can also have theirs. Why is that causing such a stick? Because it is, even when the options are laid out to have third and fourth and fifth possibilities.
Well, I think you'll be far better at analysing this than I am. I think we're looking at repeats or perhaps a mindset that we've never really escaped, where women are viewed as non-men. And the basis of attempts to control women, to engineer a society where women are pushed down to below, the kind of male ideal. I say that in quotation marks. And so is this not another arm of that? And it's a very startling, not arrived at before idea, which is, if we can't control those pesky women because they've been fighting hard to be recognized as equals in society, well, let's just remove them as a class. I mean, without evoking very hyperbolic language, it's kind of existential now, isn't it? Rather than someone justifying that women, for example, shouldn't vote because of X, Y, and Z, it's now just saying, well, actually, we as a society have had to give you a vote, but now we're going to pretend that you don't exist. It's a much deeper attack on a sex class, rather than denying them a particular service. It's denying their existence. And it just seems to me that this is the way that a patriarchy in a modern society, which largely doesn't permit, discrimination and that kind of thing, that this is a way of, like I say, a backdoor attack. And it's on the surface, and going back to what you were talking about in terms of kind of queer theory and that kind of stuff, it's reasonably kind of, I don't think it's an attractive strategy to defeat discrimination, but I do think that some of the proponents here genuinely believe the best way to prevent discrimination of females, and perhaps in very limited circumstances against males, but the way to make sure that females kind of get their due is to entirely break down the barriers between males and females, to act as if these two groups of people are not any different. And I think for some that's probably a genuine strategy to address the worldwide disparity between male and female outcomes and treatment. I think then many males have viewed this as a cause that they can hijack in order to just promote their own desires, their own kind of aims regarding women, which are fundamentally based in misogyny. So I think it has, breaking down this idea that there is some kind of separation between males and females at a social level has some value, but I don't think it's being used as an honest conversation now. I think it's become this kind of monster where it's being weaponized.